You've put together a stack of sources, articles, and notes that really zero in on a huge, complex question: the idea of bringing industrial manufacturing back to the United States.
Yeah, it's a topic absolutely packed with detail, and these sources give us a fascinating way to approach it.
So what's our mission today?
Our mission really is to unpack the realities, the challenges, and the broader implications of trying to shift these deeply entrenched global supply chains and manufacturing bases, particularly as your sources frame it, within the context of certain U.S. political goals.
Right.
We'll look at the economic, energy, and geopolitical angles your material presents. It's quite a range.
And we're starting exactly where your sources seem to start, which is with a specific political aim. It's an idea that, on the surface, appears quite compelling, almost elegantly simple. So unpacking this core proposal presented in the source material, it describes a political campaign aimed to essentially force U.S. industry back home by using tariffs. The logic described is quite direct. If companies keep manufacturing overseas because it's cheaper, well, they'd pay high tariffs. The source suggests these could help reduce the U.S. deficit.
Right.
If they want to avoid those tariffs, those costs. The clear alternative presented is manufacturing right here in the United States. Your sources note that negotiations regarding this approach are apparently ongoing, using the U.S. trade deficit as a kind of leverage point.
What's fascinating here is how quickly these sources pivot from that seemingly straightforward political goal to highlight immense practical difficulties.
Right.
They argue these challenges go beyond mathematical logic and simply cannot be changed overnight. I mean, just fundamentally.
And what's the central hurdle?
The central hurdle they emphasize is the deep, decades-long integration of China into global supply chains. Just massive. And the sources immediately delve into why that integration is so hard to undo quickly. It's not just about factories. They point out that China has become the primary refiner of raw materials globally. This isn't necessarily about inaccessible technology, they argue, but about the sheer incredible amount of energy needed for these processes.
Energy.
Refining requires a massive, continuous 247 power supply to keep operations running. And the sources say this makes relying solely on intermittent renewable energy sources, well, problematic for this specific foundational industrial step. You can't just turn it off and on.
And the data your sources provide really underlines this point. They state China produces 60% of the world's refined aluminum.
60%. Wow.
51% of it's cement and 54% of it's steel. I mean, these are all cornerstone materials produced through incredibly energy-intensive processes.
Absolutely.
Your sources contrast China's total primary energy consumption, which they say is more than the U.S. and the European Union combined, largely fueled by coal, with the U.S., which is the largest consumer of oil and gas. So very different energy profiles driving this.
Right. And if you consider that the majority of refined materials, along with, the vital production of cement and steel needed for basically all manufacturing, originate in China. The sources argue that any large-scale relocation of factories fundamentally requires China's consent, or at least cooperation. And even then, changing this dynamic would take decades.
Decades.
Yeah. This is where it gets really interesting. Your sources point out a significant paradox.
Okay.
Even the technologies needed to generate massive amounts of energy via renewables, like solar wind farms and battery systems. Well, they require refined raw materials that, according to the sources, also predominantly come from China.
So you need China's refined materials to build infrastructure to become less dependent on China's refined materials.
That's the paradox the sources highlight.
Yeah.
It's quite a knot to untangle.
And the sources are quite direct about other areas of dependency, specifically pointing to the energy transition itself. They assert China's control is overwhelming in certain key areas, particularly mentioning photovoltaics, that's solar panel tech and electric vehicle sales, noting that nearly 70% of global EV sales happen just within China.
70%. It's a huge share of that growing market.
Yeah.
And stepping back even further up the value chain, even for refining, the sources also highlight that China remains the dominant power in the extraction of many critical raw materials. So it's not just the processing, it's often the mining too.
This dependency has significant implications, including for defense, according to the sources.
Right, that comes up too.
They note that both the U.S. and the EU have realized that manufacturing weapons and ammunition relies heavily on access to both raw and refined materials, and the dependence on China for these is quite clear. The sources mention that nerves have been rattled due to low inventories of armaments, pointing out that relying solely on high-tech isn't everything if you lack the material base for production. You need the basic stuff, too.
Exactly. Which raises an important question about the broader geopolitical landscape. as explored in your sources. A perspective presented there is that the U.S. might no longer be the single hegemonic power it was after World War II,
Okay.
retaining perhaps primarily what the source calls a suffocating dominance in financial markets.
Financial dominance. Okay.
The sources suggest that utilizing systems like SWIFT, the global bank messaging network, and leveraging the dollar's reserve status, well, it's beginning to be viewed as an obstacle by some nations.
An obstacle. How so?
Well, the implication is that using these financial tools for political pressure makes some countries uneasy. Now, while China's financial markets aren't as developed, the sources note they have launched a digital payment system aimed at bypassing SWIFT controls, though this is seen as something that will take time. But the sources suggest that if the U.S. pushes too hard with pressure tactics, it could potentially lead countries to prefer negotiating with a partner they perceive as less forceful. That's the term used. And China isn't without its own levers, according to your sources. It's already placed limits on exports of materials like gallium, germanium, and tungsten.
Critical stuff for high tech.
Absolutely. Critical and high-tech components like semiconductors. The sources note China could also impose export quotas on other refined metals, potentially triggering sharp price increases globally.
So they have leverage too.
Definitely. The conclusion offered in this section of the sources is that a mutually beneficial agreement rather than a unilateral approach is the logical path forward. And if current pressure continues, the sources believe China is in no rush, maybe willing to wait for a potentially more reasonable negotiator down the line.
Okay, so if material dependency and financial dynamics are major hurdles, what about the actual process of manufacturing? Let's transition to another monumental challenge highlighted in your sources: the sheer complexity of modern supply chains.
Yeah, this is huge.
Your sources argue that changing global logistics is a monumental task because suppliers around the world are incredibly specialized, often focusing on very specific components or processes. They make a provocative point, suggesting that assembly is actually the least important part of the value chain.
Which sounds counterintuitive.
It does. But their point is, while building assembly plants in the U.S. is certainly possible, changing the origin of every single part or component that's been sourced globally over decades, well, that's presented as extremely difficult to accomplish in a short time frame, like just 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, it's not just flipping a switch.
Your sources use a fantastic example to illustrate this complexity, referencing a video about how a simple tool, the pencil, is made.
Ah, yes, the eye-pencil idea, basically.
Yeah. Exactly. They explain that manufacturing anything, even something that seems utterly basic, is actually the result of years of development involving all kinds of businesses across different locations, contributing specialized knowledge and processes. Wood from one place, graphite from another, the eraser, the paint.
What's fascinating here is how the sources interpret that video or that concept. They argue it highlights precisely how difficult it would be to significantly simplify this kind of system without losing nearly all the benefits of globalization.
Like efficiency, cost.
Exactly. Efficiency, cost-effectiveness, access to specialized expertise wherever it exists. The core idea presented is that growth and complexity have become deeply intertwined.
Okay.
If you attempt to reduce complexity in manufacturing systems, the sources argue, it inevitably leads to what they call degrowth.
Degrowth.
Yeah. They break down even the extraction step alone, needing complex machinery, fuel, specialized training, infrastructure, healthcare systems for the workers, just to show the multiple hidden layers of complexity that, many people might not immediately consider when they think about making something.
It's way more than just the factory floor.
Way more.
Now, here's where your sources present what they label the final chapter. They pose the idea that if China were somehow eliminated from the global supply chain picture, a massive hypothetical, of course.
Huge hypothetical, yeah.
The factories wouldn't necessarily return to the United States. Instead, the alternative destination presented quite clearly is that India is waiting.
India. Okay.
The sources share a well-known anecdote to back this up. Steve Jobs' reported conversation with President Obama. When asked if manufacturing jobs could return to the U.S., Jobs' alleged reply was a blunt "died. Those jobs are never coming back."
I remember reading about that.
Your sources argue that Jobs was right, having accurately predicted a fundamental trend of manufacturing shifting towards China. And they make the point that China didn't win just on labor costs.
Right. That's a common misconception.
But also on the massive availability of highly skilled workers like engineers and designers, incredible factory flexibility, speed of execution, professionalism, and dedication.
A whole ecosystem.
Exactly. The sources note this trend has included consumer electronics, high-tech goods, electric vehicles, chips, and is now, according to their analysis, even venturing into software like AI.
Your sources then use the Apple India example, known internally as Project Elephant, to detail this shift in action.
Right. Tell us about that.
They explain that Apple's relationship with manufacturing in India began years ago, initially with older iPhone models. Production significantly expanded there during the COVID-19 disruptions in China.
It makes sense. Diversification.
Moving to newer models, like the iPhone 11 and 12, though initially experiencing delays compared to global launch dates.
Yeah.
But your sources highlight the iPhone 15's production as a major milestone, noting it had simultaneous production starts in both China and India.
Simultaneous. That's a big step.
A very big step.
And the scale of India's role, according to the sources, is becoming substantial. Apple's primary supplier, Foxconn, is finalizing a huge plant near Bangalore. Your sources note its size 1.2 million square meters, making it the second largest Apple factory globally after the massive one in China known as iPhone City.
Wow. Second largest already.
Yeah. Once fully operational, this Indian plant could produce up to 30 million phones annually, which the sources estimate is about 60% of the annual U.S. demand for iPhones.
60% of U.S. demand potentially coming from just one plant in India.
That's what the sources suggest.
Connecting this back to our main theme, the sources present this India strategy as a kind of fallback plan.
Right.
They use it to illustrate why a made-in-USA iPhone, despite political calls for local manufacturing, is seen as unrealistic within the framework they've laid out.
So it's a shift away from China.
A definite shift, or at least a diversification.
But not necessarily back to the U.S., according to this analysis.
That's the argument presented in the sources, yes.
Yeah.
India is positioned as the next major hub.
This deep dive into the complexities and dependencies leads us to what your sources label their conclusion, goals and consequences.
Okay.
They reiterate the political goal we started with, seeking to bring manufacturing back to reduce dependency, particularly on China. They suggest this aim is driven by an awareness that a significant global economic contraction is on the horizon, and that there's an impending struggle for scarce resources. The goal, as framed by the sources, is to lessen external reliance before the system, in their view, explodes and a fight to the death becomes necessary. Pretty strong language.
Very strong language. But the source's conclusion here is quite stark and unequivocal. It's too late. That's what they state. The consequences, they argue, are obvious. Not only do they predict a significant economic contraction, but they believe wars will become an everyday reality. Because, in their view, the losers, defined as those lacking sufficient resources, won't passively accept their fate. The sources include Europe in this assessment of vulnerability, stating it has offshored its industrial base to Asia and lacks crucial resources, leaving it at the mercy of decisions made elsewhere.
Wow.
The source's view is that disaster is inevitable once the production of key resources like oil and copper begins to decline.
So resource decline is the trigger in this analysis.
It seems to be the key trigger they focus on, yes. Your sources even venture a timeline for these predictions. They suggest that if things continue along the path they've projected, serious problems will begin in 2030.
2030? That's not far off.
Not far at all. However, they note that tensions describing today's global friction as merely early warnings will become palpable starting in 2027.
Palpable in just a few years.
That's the timeline laid out in the material, and they circle back to one of their key points, reiterating that if China were somehow eliminated, the factories wouldn't return to the U.S. India, they state, is waiting.
Wow. It's clear these sources paint a really complex and, frankly, challenging picture. They highlight this vast gap between the political goal of rapidly reshoring manufacturing and the deeply entrenched, interconnected global realities, particularly the profound dependencies on China they describe and these emerging shifts towards places like India. It's a lot to take in.
It really does put the scale of the challenge into perspective. It's not a simple fix.
Not at all.
And thinking about everything these sources have laid out, I mean, their predictions of looming resource scarcity, economic contraction, increased conflict, all intertwined with these incredibly complex and interdependent global supply chains. It leaves us with a significant question to ponder, doesn't it?
Definitely.
Given this picture, particularly the source's prediction of future tensions, what does this all mean for how nations view global cooperation versus national self-reliance going forward? How might countries realistically navigate a future where essential needs are tied to such intricate, interdependent systems, especially if, as these sources predict, tensions rise dramatically?
That's a heavy question.
It is. But it's definitely something worth continuing to think about based on what we've unpacked today from these sources.